Yeah, no, it works.
Okay, hello everybody. Welcome. We're here to talk about collaborative investigations, particularly cross-border collaborations, and how they can have a tremendous impact. As you know, some of the most powerful investigative reporting in recent years has really been a result of big global collaborations among both local and regional news organizations and coordinating bodies like ICIJ, who we are happy to have on the panel today. This is really sort of these kind of collaborations, I think, are unique and fairly recent, I think, in journalism, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But what I'm hoping to do, I'm very excited about this panel because I am a lifelong journalist. I've not been part of collaborations like this, so I have a million questions about how this all works, when it doesn't work, how it happens. So thank you for bearing witness to my curiosity towards our panelists. So we have fantastic panelists with us today. Immediately to my left is Malia Politzer. She is an award-winning investigative journalist with more than a decade of experience working on collaborative cross-border investigations, just like we're going to talk to. She's reported from more than 15 countries and is now with Finance Uncovered for the last year, based in Spain. So we'll find out a little bit more about Finance Uncovered when we come to her. Next is Eyal Abrahami. He is the editor-in-chief of Shomrim. Shomrim is Israel's first investigation platform. It's about 3 years old now, and they've published over 200 investigative articles about Israeli society and government, including with international joint projects like the Pandora Papers and the FinCEN files. Again, we'll talk about that. But other investigations by Shomrim are published in international media like ProPublica, Washington Post, Bloomberg, and AP. Eyal was previously with Haaretz and Sheva Yamim. And then finally, Fergus Shiel. Did I pronounce your last name right? Oh, good, thank you. I should have asked you that before we got on stage. He is the managing editor for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. For the rest of this panel, I'm just going to use ICIJ, based in Washington. Fergus has overseen many recent ICIJ projects, including the Pandora Papers and the FinCEN files. Both were the biggest and second biggest global investigative journalism collaborations of their kind. He was previously with The Age and the National Times in Australia. So Fergus, I'm going to start with you because ICIJ is sort of the granddaddy of and at the center of what of these incredible, comprehensive, collaborative reporting projects. So give us a little bit of background of how ICIJ came to be. I guess, what was the gap that you were filling when you came into existence?
Thanks. What a beautiful room to be talking with you today.
Yeah.
I see some close friends here. Ben Holman, who worked with me and was integral to much of our success. Uri Blau, Malia, and Eyal, who worked with us too. ICIJ is a remarkable organisation. It's tiny. There's only about 40 of us. But we have a network of hundreds of reporters around the world that we work with. We have brought down prime ministers, presidents, had breast implants withdrawn from the market, helped to spark two of the biggest legislative changes in American history in relation to money laundering. We've also sent people to prison, caused several people to be put on trial or impeached. So how do we achieve these phenomenal results when there are so few of us. The simple way we do it is by working with reporters around the world. Working with reporters around the world, you take huge risks, working with organisations like Shomrim and Finance and Coverage. And what we do is essentially we retail a concept to reporters in newsrooms around the world. We say, this is what we would like to achieve, these are the documents we have, and then we bring them in and we work together on them in secret using two systems. The first one is a virtual newsroom called the iHub, and the second one is a platform called DataShare, which has about 100 million documents in it. And so reporters can essentially fish in peace for months or years before together producing a project that has international impact.
So to get started on these projects, of course, requires that you have a cache of documents that need to be examined on a global level. So how does that come to be? Do you rely on folks to come to you, whistleblowers, with leaked documents? Do you go out and seek them based on stories that you want to pursue, or how does that work?
So it can work in a variety of different ways. So there are big leaks. We have dealt with some of the biggest leaks, perhaps the biggest leaks in the world. So Pandora Papers was 11.9 million documents. Paradise Papers was, I think, about 11 billion documents. But you don't need a huge leak in order to transform people's thinking, in order to produce change. Some of the most important projects we've done have had tiny leaks or no leak at all. So one of the projects we did was China cables. That was only about 60 pages of information, but it was the information that was the foundation stone for the Uyghur camps, the Uyghur internment camps. And as a result of that report, those reports by investigative reporters in about 30 countries, we managed to help to change the world's position on the Uyghurs and to produce international, amplify calls for international change. So that's one example. Another example would be the implant files, which was this, I think it's the third biggest project in history that ICIJ was involved with. In that case, they were public records, but what we did was we trolled them because no one else had done it. And what we identified was 1.7 million previously unreported deaths caused by medical implants. We revealed that India had had only 14 recalls of medical implants that killed people and injured people in 7 years, whilst America had hundreds. And they were the same implants that were in India as in America. And so people were literally dying around the world because nothing was being done. And that was entirely based on medical records. And when we finished our project, as we have done so many other times, we created a database of recalled medical devices, similar to another database that we have, which is offshore leaks database, which helps countries around the world to identify narco-traffickers, Ponzi schemers, oligarchs, kleptocrats.
Right, so you're saying in some cases these are open source documents that simply nobody has examined. In the case of documents that are leaked to you, what questions do you ask, if any, about who the leaker is and their motivations, or is that irrelevant to you? And then related to that, how do you authenticate those documents? And we're going to come to your partners in a minute. Or is that part of the collaboration? Is that authentication?
They're really good questions. So with the China cables one, there was a massive effort went in by our partners to make sure that the documents which we had, which included, as I said, this foundation stone for the camps, plus these telegrams which showed that the Chinese were using artificial intelligence to identify thousands and thousands of people that were going into the camps. With that, we poured a huge amount of effort into making sure that the documents were what they were supposed to be, because the thing is, as a reporter, as a news organisation, and particularly as ICIJ, because we take on so many powerful people, your credibility is all that you have. If you lose your credibility, you lose your business. The stories are vital, but the credibility is even more vital. And so with that, we literally got forensic experts to look at the documents, Chinese language experts to look at the documents, We identified a character in it called Zoo Highland. We tracked him around the world to see where he was. Was he where he was supposed to be at the time that the document said? So that's one example. With others, with the financial leaks, really, when you get 11.9 million documents from 14 offshore providers, it's simply the case that nobody could forge them. You just have to accept they're real because nobody could do it. You need industrial scale forgery.
And the motivation of the leakers is of no concern to you?
So this is what I would say about that. As a reporter, you should always accept information. You should accept information and work on it in the public interest. I would not be burdened by the motivation of the leaker.
No, I think most news organizations would probably say the same. So I want to talk about, as a segue into bringing in our other panelists, I'll throw one more question to you, Fergus, which is, how do you select collaborators in each country, or do they self-select?
It's a good question. So ICIJ, in its current form, has existed. It's existed for 25 years, but as a really powerful news organisation, it's been in operation for maybe 12 years. And so during that period, what we've done is we've built relationships of trust with news organisations and individual reporters. Actually, we operate more reporter to reporter than we do reporter to news organisations. And so we have this group of trusted reporters who we know will work hard, who we know who will maintain confidentiality, and we tend to go back to them time and time again. But as each successive project evolves, we also bring in others, and we bring them in based on geography, based on expertise, and often based on general pleasantness. So if we
that
like
matters.
someone, it matters a heap. So if you like somebody and they do good work, there's a chance that you will work.
Okay, well, great. So let me turn to you now, Eyal. So Shomrim is a new player on the scene, really dedicated to investigative reporting in Israel, and not a moment too soon, I might add. So talk a little bit, just tell us first of all briefly a little bit about Shomrim, since people may not be familiar with it. But also you were recently part of the ICIJ network for the Pandora paper. So talk about what that experience was like.
So Shomrim was established 3.5 years ago as a non-profit, as the first Israeli investigative platform, like Vivian said before. We work with all of the Israeli media. We actually come and suggest the stories that we found within our investigations. Most of the stories are being published in other outlets, and most, I'm saying, we're getting to about 90% of stories that are being picked up by other outlets. We have some international collaborations as well. We published in various and quite in a few number of outlets in the world. As for Pandora, it was more surprising. I mean, I'm not talking only about the Israeli angle of it. We got the invitation to join the project, and then all suddenly you ask yourself as an editor, what are we going to do with that? You get access to 12 million documents. And when we say
what
document,
do you do?
yeah, and when you say a document is not just a paper with the story as a headline on top of it. A document can be 500 pages with the story on page 499, and you have to read them. So we have Uri Blau, who is sitting here on the front row. He's one of our top journalists, and he took the project on himself. He needed 8 months to deal with it. We had 8 or 9 stories came out of the Pandora papers. How did we do it? That was like the big question. How are we going to get into that stuff? So the first thing to do was to build a list of names of Israelis we were interested. We wanted to know if they have an offshore account somewhere. Politicians, financiers, public people, people with some kind of interest in them. And we had to build the list. That took about, let's say, 2 months or so. And when you do it in a different language, which is not English, obviously, the problem is not only building the list, but actually finding the right transcript of the name, because the names can be written in various ways. So each name was checked in a few ways. Like each name appeared in our list, like 4 or 5 different transcripts in English. And then we searched the documents for those names. We came up with some results, not all of them, by the way. Some of them, the transcription did not identify exactly the name. And when we finished that, we put those stories aside and we started looking for addresses in Israel, generic names like Tel Aviv or the names of Israeli banks and so on and so on. I think about 3 months into the work, we had a list of documents that some Israelis of interest were mentioned in them. And that was the time of the really hard work, to start reading the documents. And that's what Uri did for another 5 months. When we found a name that had an offshore and we were interested, the story from the document looked interesting, we dug into the story itself. Basically, I can say that those 8-9 stories we had were picked up in the Israeli media alone over 90 times, which was just phenomenal for us, especially as a new, young organization, as a new organization. That was a huge success, and we're still grateful to the ICIJ for accepting us to it.
So how does it work when you are one of the partners? Obviously your focus is on covering events as they relate to Israel, but were there any restrictions on what you could report on? In other words, if you had so chosen, could you report on findings from the papers that were about another country? Or conversely, maybe another partner could decide that they wanted to report about stories in Israel. Is there any kind of restrictions on that?
No, there are no restrictions. Fergus mentioned it before. This joint this joint platform that the ICIJ built is a place where everybody has to share his finding. And many of the investigations, including ours, were across countries. For example, the story we had about Chaim Ramon. He's the next minister in the Israeli government. He had an offshore company that was working from Cyprus, and he had all kind of business with an Austrian billionaire called Martin Schlaff, who is a casino owner, a few casinos owner. And the story was very interesting. It went to another country, it went to Montenegro. So we worked together with those journalists. Each one brought his own angle, brought his own story, and the stories were actually published in all 3 countries.
But different stories. Obviously, everybody had their own take on it.
Each one chose the angle that was interesting for him, but the information was shared. So basically, I believe you can do a story on another country, but the great advantage of working with journalists, with experts from another countries who know what you're doing is helping so much. You don't want to do it yourself.
Yeah. I'm curious, and I'll come back to this later, if there's ever really conflicts amongst the news organizations. One more question to you, and then I'll come to Malia. You had mentioned to me that some of the, that since working on the Pandora Papers project, you've since adopted some of the methods from that experience across all your reporting. So I'm just curious what those are.
We understood the vast impact that it has working with other outlets, with journalists from all over the world. And we did it again and again with great success. When you work with other countries, you get different perspectives, you get different ideas about the stories, and you simply get much, much more. That's why we repeated it again and again, and it's so successful that we'll keep doing it for as long as we can.
Great. So Malia, first of all, tell us a little bit about Finance Uncovered, since it's a fairly news organization. I'm sure people like myself would like to know. And then how do you approach a collaboration? You, of course, worked on ICIJ collaborations before Finance Uncovered. So I'm interested in what you brought from that to your work now.
Yeah, so Finance Uncovered, similar to ICIJ, but much, much, much smaller. We're about 5 people, and our office is based out of the UK, and we really are focused on follow the money investigations, investigating illicit finance, corruption, but beyond, we do participate, and Finance Uncovered did participate in the Pandora Papers and Luanda leaks and some of the big leaks. But we also coordinate much smaller investigations with maybe a handful of partners around the world. Most of our partners tend to be in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And we also have two other pillars, which is help desk requests, because oftentimes, reporters aren't necessarily, and this is all reporters, unless they're working for Bloomberg, don't necessarily have a lot of the financial literacy to read company reports and find all of the data there that could really help them with their stories. So that's something we support them with, to finding documents, understanding how to read the documents, understanding, if they run into a wall, that's something that we can help mentor them with. And then we also offer courses about how to read company reports, investigate corruption, that sort of thing. And what we found is actually these three things feed into each other, because oftentimes the people that come to with help desks, that'll end up being its own collaborative investigation. They'll say, oh, well, this is really helpful. Would you like to work on this with us? And then we'll help identify other partners. If it is like an international scope story, which is what happened with recently, an investigation we did on international surrogacy organization. There's a reporter in Kenya who approached us for some help desk issues. We mentored her on the project, and that ended up spurring a follow-up investigation involving reporters in Georgia, Estonia, Mexico. So it all kind of feeds into each other.
So you are both sort of a hub and spoke in a way, on a smaller scale in a way that ICIJ is, but also working part of the partner network as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So you had mentioned to me that over the course of working on ICIJ projects and now, of course, with these other projects, that there are sort of a few kind of lessons learned that you've walked away from for what makes a successful collaboration. Just mention a few of those, and then we'll ask the other panelists to jump in as well.
Well, this is really, on the logistical organizational level, and this again for smaller ones, I'm not talking about the gigantic leak databases, which we have done as participants, but don't like, that's not kind of our wheelhouse, what we organize. But for example, with the baby broker project, which, this Kenyan reporter, Naipanoy, came to us with asking for some help investigating these shell companies that were operating in Kenya and putting together it was low-cost international surrogacy, kind of matching mostly European and American intended parents with surrogates in Kenya, and that turned into this larger investigation where we were kind of drilling down into one specific company called New Life, which had a shell company, it was an LLP in the UK, but we saw where they were operating was operating in Mexico, Estonia, Georgia. So the first thing is what reporting partners are necessary for this, right? So you have to be really selective about who you choose to work with. People preferably who know how to be collaborative, people who have their own publishing platforms, or, with Naipanoy, for example, was a freelancer, but, she'd worked very closely with the Elephant and Africa Uncensored in Kenya. I do think it's really important to kind of set expectations up front with partners in terms of like how we're going to share information, if there's any information that's more sensitive, sources that are too sensitive, and then just making sure that there's a coordinator. So in this case, we ended up being kind of the global coordinator to make sure that, reporters, because they are all working for the most part full-time, have a lot of competing priorities. So making sure that, we had semi-regular meetings and just kept everyone abreast on what everyone else was doing. In this case, they didn't decide that they wanted to have regular group meetings because there were too many people in too many time zones. So we kind of played that role of making sure that we were sharing information and requests and documents with all of the other reporters. And then agreeing on publication schedules, publication kind of social media strategies to get the word out, names of the project and that sort of thing.
So there's a tremendous amount of trust that is entailed with putting together these collaborations. You need to trust that your partners are not going to break an embargo, for example. I also imagine you have to trust that all parties will be responsible in terms of not publishing information that could risk somebody's life, for example. So I'm curious, and Fergus, but I'll throw it open to anybody here. Surely this has not been perfect in every instance, or has it?
Surprised to hear you say that.
Yeah.
Of course it has been. No, it's difficult. It's challenging. So I think past successes inspire people to maintain professionalism throughout. I think our work with news organisations creates a kind of halo effect for those news organisations where they can see, as Eyal mentioned, the enormous benefit of pausing. So much of what we do as reporters is busy, and it's daily or weekly, and many news organisations, the ultimate is to do something over a month. We're completely different. We're slow news. We don't do that. We step out from the stream and build our boat and then set sail. And we do that because we think we have a far greater impact. And we know we have a far greater impact because, as I said, we have changed legislation. We have seen medical devices removed from markets. At the moment, there are probably yachts being seized because of our work. Yachts of oligarchs. We believe firmly that truth matters, that getting to the truth is hard, that you should take your time to get to the truth, because ultimately that openness and that truthfulness produces accountability. And in our case, what we want is accountability on a global scale. And we want accountability on a global scale because there's no global democracy. And we feel that we are contributing to that impetus for accountability on a global scale. And doesn't matter to us whether the accountability comes in North Carolina, where there's a young guy who dies from a fentanyl overdose as a result of money that's come from China via Canada, or it's an oligarch having their yacht seized, or it's Isabel dos Santos' empire collapsing around her feet. It doesn't matter to us so long as the work that we do is in the public interest, the work that we do is intense, and that not only do we share that work, but we also ultimately share much of the data with the public so that our work can have a long tail. And some of our stories have implications, have impact months, years later, even decades later.
Yeah, I mean, I think the impact and the extraordinary journalism that has come out of these collaborations, it speaks for itself. I'm sorry to be obsessing about process, but I just think it's so interesting. I mean, this is, presumably a room full of journalists. We know how competitive journalists are. So even just the notion of newsrooms collaborating on anything is a little bit mind-bending. So, has there been, and then I want to come to you, Eyal, and on something similar in a second, but have you had to, I mean, obviously if a news organization is a bad actor, you won't work with them again. But do you have any kind of lever in case they sort of go off the rails, I guess?
Yeah, so there is tension. So the tension primarily is around market share. Okay, that's where the tension is. And so what we typically do is on a project is we will have one TV company, maybe 2 newspapers per country, and one not-for-profit. So that removes that tension, and then we can change that formula depending on the country. So there are clashes and I have to manage those clashes, and it does require a great deal of diplomacy, and those clashes move from country to country. At the moment, there's some tension in Middle Europe, which I won't go into, but anyway, it is extreme, and I will negotiate our way through it, and people will come out the other side. So that's one thing. The other thing in relation to bad actors, we do occasionally, but I have to say very occasionally, have concerns about the security of our data during a project.
Oh, yeah.
We had one guy very briefly work for the BBC, who had to be booted from the project because he was working at the same time for corporate intelligence. His role with the BBC lasted, I think, 3.5 weeks before he was outed and he was dispatched. And we are not so naive as to think that there aren't others who we don't know about. But what I can say is that in our experience broadly, our partners are hugely collaborative and have been a pleasure to work with.
And Eyal, I imagine you must have to take cybersecurity of these documents extremely carefully.
Yes, and it is a game of trust. especially in a platform like Shomrim that uses other outlets to publish its content. So if they don't, we can't trust them, we can't actually work. So over our years, and that was a very good surprise, over the 3 years we were working and the few hundred stories we did, we only had one case of an outlet that violated our trust. They said they weren't interested in the story, and they printed a very similar story briefly after. What we did was we stopped working with that outlet. And, and they called us a couple of times after and asked, hey, can we come back and so on? We said, no, thank you very much. No trust, no game. As for the big projects, the international ones, like Pandora was the first, before, we take like a week and a half before the publication, especially when the stories are so complicated, we send them an agreement saying we have a story, a big story, those are basically the headlines, we want you to know that the deadline is so and so, please commit that it wouldn't happen before, that you won't change the stories, that you wouldn't do anything which is wrong, and so far it worked perfectly, nobody violated it. And it was funny to see that rival outlets that usually would kill each other are all obeying, nobody broke the deadline, surprisingly.
It is, yeah.
Well,
the threat of not being part of the next project has to be pretty great.
It has. I wasn't going to go into this, but our single biggest, our cause celeb, which has been reported, so therefore I will go into it, was the New York Times published a rival project to China Cables 1 week before us. And that was...
Sorry, which project was that?
So we did China Cables, and the New York Times produced one a week out from it without telling us, even though they were on the China Cables one. They were profusely apologetic. They said it was a failure of internal communications. But that, I can say, was the single worst week of my time at ICIJ, because there were many other partners on that project, and many of them have still to forgive the New York Times, and may never forgive the New York Times. And so we viewed that was a very poor behavior. And as a result, now our agreements stipulate that people who are working on similar projects at the same time have to tell us.
And was that New York Times story, I vaguely remember this, was that New York Times story based on documents that ICIJ made available?
No, so they were doing a Xinjiang project at the same time as us, but they embarked upon ours at the same time.
But that seems fair game then, it's their own reporting.
I don't think it was fair game at all, and nor did the New York Times at the end. I think what they did was completely discourteous. I think what they did was outrageous, because they used our publication date, they knew our publication date, and
I see.
They essentially gazumped us, and I am still annoyed about it.
I see, yeah. Okay, so I guess ICIJ will not be working with the New York Times anytime soon. Are there any, Malia, are there any times where collaboration, even where there's large data sets, is inappropriate?
Well, when it comes to the large, that's hard for me to answer because I have mostly worked collaboratively, so I can speak more about the strengths. But I've also, I was a freelancer for years, so I have worked on my own as well. But I think when it comes to some of these complex international stories, there's just so much advantage to working collaboratively, especially when you have, for example, issues around, we've been working with the ICIJ for quite some time on this art beat that came out of the Pandora Papers. I've continued at Finance Uncovered, and one of the things that we've been able to kind of join is looking at looted antiquities, then end up in Western museums, but by working with local partners and organizations that are trying to trace them, actually tracing them back to the sites. And so I think that having an international team where you're working on an equal basis with reporters in countries of origin, reporters where, corporate malpractice is actually manifesting, you just get a much more rich and, I think, impactful story, also because then you have that published in the countries where you're seeing the damage happen, as opposed to just for American audience. So I'm sure that there are examples where, it's a smaller story, and you would want to just do it yourself. That's not really what we specialize in and what we do. We tend to focus on the collaborative side.
All right, I want to come back, I'll just stick with you for a minute. I want to come back to the provenance of the information. There are sort of I guess you would call them good faith whistleblowers who provide these documents because they want people to be held accountable for their actions. What about a case, for example, like, you know, the recent case of the last couple of weeks of the 21-year-old U.S. airman who released the intelligence documents on Discord to show off to his friends, for example. This is not a whistleblower. This is, frankly, just like a stupid kid. So it would appear. Again, go ahead.
I guess the first thing I'd say is that I can speak only for ICIJ. So ICIJ's projects are not data dumps. It's not you get a whole lot of documents and you do a WikiLeaks. We are not WikiLeaks. When we get the documents, we carefully consider those documents to see what the public interest is. We do not simply throw them up on our site. We do not simply say, look at us, we have these documents, aren't we great? So we spend months and years calculating what the public interest is and whether what we are producing at the end is going to be for the benefit of for the story and the world, frankly. And we even in the cases of bad actors, people who have done atrocious things, people that have stolen banks, that have brought countries to their knees, that have murdered people, that have trafficked people, we respect their privacy and we do not put their passport up on our sites. We do not put their bank details up on our sites. We don't. So we view our role is to produce the best reporting we can, the best stories we can, but it is not in any way, it's not there for show. It's there to cause harm. It's there to cause good.
That makes sense. That's a good distinction between what you do and what WikiLeaks is. So I'm going to go to the audience just momentarily for questions, but let me just throw one more question to you, Eyal. And then others can jump on this too. I have to imagine as generative AI sort of explodes as it has in recent months, and the quality of being able to spoof written documents, moving images, photographs, everything. What impact is that going to have on this kind of collaborative work?
I think it will have some serious impact on those, because the public interest is really growing higher and higher. We feel like we're in the center now, and everyone wants those collaborations. Everyone wants those more information and more investigative. And the capabilities we have as investigative platform is pretty unique these days. At least in Israel, the other outlets have less and less investigative journalists because it is so expensive. That's basically
yeah. Fergus, has ICIJ been thinking about this at all?
Yeah, so it's funny, we've been thinking of the benign effects of AI and how AI can help us to sift through documents.
True, right.
I know I'm going to move to your next point. Am I worried? Yeah, gravely. I mean, I think, you never know, but I mean, it ought to be deeply concerning that a robot can write better stories than we can. That ought to be deeply concerning. It ought to be deeply concerning that a robot can produce a story that looks almost true, but has one fact in it that isn't true. The production of photos that are fake is mind-boggling. I saw, most of you probably saw this the other day. There was one of the Middle Eastern countries had a newsreader that was a robot, that was created. It was a hologram created by AI, reading news that was created by AI. So yes, I think it's a staggering leap of faith on behalf of mankind, and mankind has made previous staggering leaps of faith that haven't worked out so well. So I'm concerned.
Great. So I can continue my education about this, but I thought maybe I would throw it open to the room to see what questions you have. I don't know if we have mics floating around, or you may just need to shout. So who's got a question? Just over here.
Look at that. I'm Tom. I run a media house in Sudan called Ain Media.
Did you say Sudan?
Yeah.
Well.
I just have a couple sort of, we've done some collaborative investigative work with sort of larger organizations, and it's mostly been positive, but there's been two challenges which I see if you guys could address them really. One is that we get these sort of investigative bodies approach us because they don't really have the context or the knowledge of the country. And they're beholden to donors. And it's a bit like what Fergus was actually saying, is that they have these kind of time limits as to how long an investigation can go on. And for us, I want to do things slowly and make sure it's safely done and properly done. But we're often pushed for time because, Bill Gates or whoever who's funding this particular investigation, needs this to be filed by a certain date. And the second challenge I've come across is that, while the investigative, the international investigative body who wants to collaborate with us has certain skill sets, certainly, in sort of looking into finances and data and so on, they don't actually know much about Sudan or the country that we're working on. So in actual fact, most of the work lies on our shoulders, and actually all the kind of the dangerous work of actually, physically looking into things has fallen onto us. So I don't know if there's a solution to that, or I'm just sort of curious if other people have also faced those kind of challenges, or what we might be able to do to elongate investigative projects.
I can answer some of that. One of the strategies that has worked really well for us, because we do a lot of work in Africa, is really cultivating national partners, and I think that setting expectations, both with and in the case where you don't have the funding, we've gone and looked for funding, right? So we've been funded by the Politzer Center. We have other foundations that we've worked with to get funding to fund specific projects, but I do think that setting expectations up front about timelines, and that with investigations they're necessarily squishy, is necessary. I think that having local partners who are equal partners, not fixers, is really, really critical, because they bring that local knowledge and can, give the context and have the deep sourcing, and then also like to publish in that country. I think, when it's safe to do so, also really amplifies the impact that you would otherwise get. And I'm trying to remember what the third point that you had raised was what about the timeline? And not having the knowledge. Well, I think that can be tricky. Sometimes you might choose, that can also depend on who you bring as another partner, right? As another collaborator, someone who can kind of fill that gap. And hopefully, and one of the things that we do is actually mentor reporters to try to kind of fill that gap. So in the long run, they can continue to do the work themselves and at a higher level, with now that new skill set that is part of what we provide through the help desk and also the coaching. But it also can be kind of a strategic decision of what other partners you bring in to kind of build the team. So maybe this one partner doesn't have it, but this other one does, and then you collaborate closely so they can kind of fill that investigative gap in your team.
Just here in the front. And please say your name and your affiliation.
Hi, my name is Tomáš Madleniak. I am working for the Investigative Center of Jan Kuciak in Slovakia. I have noticed a lot of wonder how could this kind of stuff like collaboration actually work between people who are basically competitors. So I just wanted to mention first, then I actually have a question. I wanted to mention that after the Jan Kuciak murder, we have obtained from a source the whole police file on the Jan Kuciak murder, which was 70 terabytes of data, 70. And we have successfully collaborated with over 12 media from Slovakia, from TVs through tabloids, series, dailies and weeklies. And nobody ever broke a memorandum, nobody ever broke a deadline.
Impressive.
And we have published dozens of stories from this. And this just shows that this can work if you really believe that you are doing this for some kind of higher principle, not just for money. And I think that's crucial. But now to my question. When it comes to international and intercontinental, let's say, collaborations, how do you deal with different ethical and legal frameworks that people operate in, because there are certain ways of obtaining information that could be considered both legal and even ethical in one part of the world, but absolutely out of the question in another. So how do you deal with this?
Go ahead.
It's nice to see you. Actually, I often think of Jan and Martina. And I saw Pavla Holkova earlier today, and who I like immensely. And I did admire greatly what you did after Jan's death. And I saw that room that you operated in with your sitting around. And it is one of the most ghastly things that has happened to any reporter, Jan's death. And it actually sits very heavily on my shoulders, and it makes me very sad that that happened, and it makes me very sad for Slovakia. In relation to the international sort of difference in editorial expectations and legal expectations, what we do is we let each country do their own thing. As Eyal said, ICIJ imposes no stricture on people. We can't tell somebody like Tom in Sudan how to write his story or what's important, or somebody in Slovakia what's important. The virtue of our model, the whole purpose of our model, is that you decide yourself what's important in your country, and that we simply enable you to do that through working with other reporters, because, as you know, with Jan's death, it wasn't just people from Slovakia that were implicated, and that is sadly the nature of global corruption. There is no crime in the world that has a national border, or very few that have a national border. It's international. Money travels within seconds. In the FinCEN files, we watch $2 trillion worth of money, of dark money flowing. Western banks looking at the money as it caused mayhem around the world. In the Pandora Papers, thousands and thousands of companies, all devoted to secrecy, to opaqueness, to nefarious business. In Luanda Leaks, we looked at Isabel DeSantis, 400 companies in 40 countries, more than $2 billion stolen from the poorest country, in one of the poorest countries in the world, and this money swishing through banks, swishing through law firms and accountancies and other enablers across the world to multiple countries where she enriched herself at the expense of the poorest in the world. And that is why our model is about empowering each country to work on what's important to them.
I want to add to that. When we worked with other countries, we went for the stricter rules. When we work with American outlets, they have ethics which is a bit higher than what we have in Israel. We went for their ethics. That was the only way it can work.
Just up front here, we only have a couple of minutes, so I think what I'll do is I will take your question and I will take the question here. Let's take both questions in a row and then we'll answer both.
Hello, my name is Christina. I'm not an affiliated any kind of network. I'm a freelance journalist, currently based in Portugal. And I was trying to do something like this, a kind of cross-border, smaller investigation. And I was just wondering why you were referring to all this, if it has not to be the need, which has happened in the past, that you need a legacy media in each country to publish. Because if we just spoke about Isabel DeSantis and the Panama Papers, Pandora, I don't remember, I think it was in everyone. That's at least how I saw it. And you need a media in Portugal because the laws are very different, even in Europe, which I find, I'm sorry about that, to be honest, that we, even in the EU, now UK has left, don't have a minimum basis of what is allowed to do in an investigation. How do you see this in general for your work? Thank you.
And then let me just take the question over here.
Hi, can you hear me? Perfect. My name is Belle. I'm a leading editor for the European Correspondent. We're basically a startup with correspondents all over Europe and breaking cross-border stories like that. I think what we've discussed a lot is the collaboration between journalists cross borders, but what I wonder about and what we kind of see as a challenge as well is how do you make readers care about things that happen across the border. For example, Eyal said you adapt a story to the national country and context that you're speaking to, But is there a way to make readers care beyond their own borders?
Go ahead, Eyal.
Well, you know, it's always difficult, especially on the complicated stories, to make it readable. You know, you have 10,000 words and you have to make them something that the reader would care about. And I think the answer is you basically need a good editor that would do it. That's his job. That's what he's supposed to do. Sometimes as an editor, I don't know if I'm good or not, but as an editor, I can tell you that on those stories, sometimes it's extremely difficult. Because they're so long, because they're so complicated and so on. But if television taught us something, teaches us something, then it's that sometimes you can go for the shorter version, for the easier story, just to get the rating, just to get the story going, and then you can do the other parts of it.
Anyone else? Go ahead, Malia. This will have to be the last.
No, I just wanted to clarify your question. You were asking about cross-border collaborations as a freelancer and how to make that work? Or you're talking about just the difficulty with...
What I was referring to is what are the legal aids in some ways.
Legal?
Yeah, legal.
Okay.
As a freelancer, how to...
That's a bit important because every country has a different way of handling.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can tell you from a Finance Uncovered perspective, I mean, our outfit's based in the UK, which has extremely rigorous libel laws, oftentimes more than a lot of other countries. So we do an extreme kind of lawyered version, and we have to kind of also, sometimes there are times where we don't publish something that a partner might publish on our site for that reason, because we know that it wouldn't fit through our laws. But when it comes to, as a freelancer doing it, we have offered support to our partners who are freelancers and found like local lawyers to help them with that aspect because, freelancers often don't have that sort of budget, or put them in touch with people. Yeah, no, exactly. Or found funding or put them in touch with, the resources to be able to do that.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're out of time. So thank you very much to our panelists and to all of you.